the lines between civilian and military targets is a characteristic of total war. Strategic bombing demonstrates this concept, as children, women, and the elderly are most affected by aerial bombardment because most men have been sent off to the front. The Axis powers were the first to employ terror bombing. Their objective was to break the morale of the population through indiscriminate bombings that targeted civilian population centers. In April 1937, aircraft of the German Condor Legion, supporting Franco's Spanish nationalists, bombed the Basque city of Guernica in northern Spain. It was market day and the streets were filled. German aircraft dropped incendiary bombs and strafed the panicked civilians. British journalist Noel Monks wrote that he was haunted by the charred bodies of women and children. 4 months later, and half a world away, the Japanese employed terror bombing in their attacks on the Chinese cities of Shanghai and Nanjing. Once again, civilians were the primary targets. These raids and the Guernica attack demonstrated the ability of air forces to strike distant targets at will. This ability to project power and deliver destruction beyond the traditional front lines of the battlefield was next displayed when the Germans bombed Warsaw in the opening hours of their invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939. That attack prompted President Roosevelt to urge all combatants to refrain from bombing civilian targets. His appeal fell on deaf ears. On September 25th, the Luftwaffe returned to Warsaw in the largest air raid ever conducted up to that time, dropping more than 600 tons of bombs on the city. The Luftwaffe's May 1940 attack on Rotterdam, a key North Sea port, came despite the Netherlands' declared neutrality. The Germans had demanded that the Dutch surrender or be bombed. The Dutch surrendered, and were bombed anyway when news of their decision failed to reach the attacking squadrons in time. The bombing ignited a fire which strong winds accelerated into a hellish inferno. 1,000 civilians were killed and 85,000 left homeless. The bombings of Guernica, Shanghai, Nanjing, Warsaw, and Rotterdam promoted delusions about the vulnerability of civilian populations, according to historian Max Hastings. Hitler and the Luftwaffe believed that societies would succumb to panic in the face of the mere fact of assault from the air. This reasoning contributed to the Luftwaffe's shift from military to civilian targets during the latter stages of the Blitz. From the winter of 1940-41 into the spring, heavy night raids were carried out against British cities. But the Blitz failed to break the English, and it failed to force British capitulation. By June 1941, Hitler, having given up on an invasion of the British Isles, had shifted to a new strategy for isolating Britain, knocking out the Soviet Union. Well before the war, Britain had envisioned strategic bombing as a way by which future wars could be won without the commitment of large numbers of ground troops as had been required in the First World War. Britain had hoped that the threat of strategic bombing would be able to prevent war, or if war came, to deter attacks on British cities. It didn't. The British quickly discovered that their own heavy bombers could not penetrate German air defenses during daylight without suffering unacceptable losses. As a result, Bomber Command switched to nighttime attacks on cities or area targets, what the Germans called Terrorangriff, terror bombing. The objective was to break German morale in part by dehousing German workers. One of the most successful Bomber Command missions came at Hamburg in July 1943. The attack created a firestorm that killed 50,000 people. The American 8th Air Force began flying bombing missions in the fall of 1942. American aerial bombing doctrine was based on formations of heavily armed bombers providing their own protection against enemy fighters. Flying in daylight, American bombers would accurately bomb military targets. This, the Americans believed, removed the moral ambiguity of bombing. In reality, American bombers, like their British counterparts, were unable to protect themselves, leading to unsustainable losses. Also, like the British, bombing accuracy was abysmal, with only 16% of bombs dropped, falling within 1,000 feet of the target. The introduction of a new escort fighter in late 1943 changed the nature of the air war. The P-51, nicknamed the Mustang, had the range to escort Allied bombers all the way to their targets and back, providing a new level of protection from German fighter aircraft. As a result, 1944 was the most productive bombing year of the war when measured by tonnage dropped. The February 1945 bombing of the city of Dresden is often used to challenge the morality of Allied strategic bombing. The result of the raid was a firestorm that continued for days, killed between 25 and 40,000, and left the city in a desolate wasteland. Critics claimed that the war by then was almost over, and that Dresden was not a military target. Of course, the war was almost over only in hindsight. At the time of the raid, Allied forces in Germany had just recovered from Hitler's Great Winter Offensive, a sign that the Germans had no intentions of surrendering. A closer look at Dresden also shows that the city was a legitimate military target, a transportation hub, as well as a center for the production of optics and communications equipment. With the capture of the Mariana Islands in the Pacific in July 1944, the United States was able to build air bases from which the new B-29 bomber could reach Japan's home islands. Now it was the U.S. that was bombing area targets at night. On the night of March 9-10, 1945, more than 300 B-29s set fire to 25% of Tokyo. The resulting firestorm killed 100,000, making it the deadliest conventional bombing in history. Was strategic bombing decisive? In Germany during 1944, the year of the heaviest Allied bombing, industrial production actually increased. German city dwellers, though badly battered by night and day bombing, never broke. Likewise, the Japanese, though losing 100,000 citizens in one horrible night, did not consider surrender. In Germany, it would take Red Army troops subduing Berlin street by street to force surrender. In Japan, it would take something even more destructive, the dropping of not one but 2 atomic bombs. Flying from the island of Tinian, a B-29 dropped the first such weapon on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. 3 days later, Nagasaki was bombed. Incredibly, the news of this second atomic attack seemed to have no impact on Japan's ruling council. It took the Japanese another 6 days to surrender, and then only as a result of intervention by the emperor. The loss of life from Allied bombings has been estimated at 600,000 in Germany and 300,000 in Japan, not including the 2 atomic strikes. The atomic bombings make the numbers killed even more dreadful. How can such loss of life be considered morally tenable when the largest numbers of these were civilians? War itself is morally untenable unless it is forced upon a country, as was clearly the case in World War II. Faced with aggression, the Allies responded with overwhelming force, including aerial bombardment, the objective of which was to hasten the end of the war and by doing so save lives. Based on the ferocity of Japanese resistance on Okinawa, American military planners estimated that 1 million might die in an invasion of Japan's home islands. In the dreadful calculus of war, this is the strongest argument in favor of the use of atomic weapons against Japan.